On a freezing winter night, a wealthy but reclusive lord sits alone in his grand manor, haunted by his past. Suddenly, a group of sickly orphans appears at his door, shivering and desperate, whispering, "Be our father before we die here." The plea pierces his hardened heart, forcing him to confront the life he has lived and the man he could still become. What begins as an act of charity turns into a redemption tale that will change the fate of both the Lord and the children forever. But can a man who has spent decades running from his own pain truly become the father these children need before time runs out? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The manor stood against the winter sky like a monument to solitude. Thornfield Manor, they called it, though few in the village below ever spoke its name without a certain reverence, or perhaps it was fear. The estate sprawled across the hillside, its stone walls gray and imposing, its windows dark even in daylight. Smoke rose from a single chimney, a thin thread of evidence that someone still lived within those cold walls. Lord Edmund Ashworth had not always been a ghost in his own home. There were those in the village who remembered a different man, a younger man with kind eyes and ready laughter. Mrs. Pemberton at the bakery still spoke of the day he'd carried her groceries through a spring rain, refusing payment and joking about the weather. Thomas Fletcher, who tended the manor's grounds, could recall summer afternoons when Edmund would roll up his sleeves and work alongside the staff, talking of plans for the future with an enthusiasm that made everyone around him believe in possibilities. But that was before. Before the winter, 20 years passed when Eleanor Ashworth had gone into labor on a December night much like this one. Before the midwife's worried whispers and the doctor's grim pronouncements. Before the silence that fell over the manor when the crying stopped. When both mother and child were lost in a single terrible night. Edmund was 58 now, though he looked older. His hair had gone silver, not gradually but seemingly all at once in the months following Eleanor's death. His face, once open and warm, had set into lines of careful neutrality. He moved through the vast rooms of Thornfield like a man walking through a museum, observing but not touching, present but not living. The manor itself reflected its master's state. In Eleanor's time, every room had buzzed with life. Fresh flowers adorned the tables, curtains were drawn back to let in light, fires crackled in multiple hearths. Music had drifted from the piano in the drawing room, where Eleanor would play in the evenings, while Edmund read aloud from whatever book had captured her interest that week. Now the drawing room stood empty, the piano's keys untouched and slowly falling out of tune. Dust sheets covered furniture in rooms that hadn't seen visitors in years. The dining hall, which had once hosted gatherings of 24 or more, set a table for one each evening. Edmund took his meals in silence, served by Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper who had been with the family since Edmund was a boy. Mrs. Hawthorne was 73, her back bent from decades of service, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of both joy and sorrow. She had loved Eleanor like a daughter, and grieved her loss almost as deeply as Edmund had. But where Edmund had turned inward, Mrs. Hawthorne had grown harder, her warmth cooling into efficiency. She ran the household with stern precision, keeping the staff at a distance and discouraging any familiarity. If Edmund wanted isolation, she would ensure he had it. The staff had dwindled over the years. Where once a dozen servants had bustled through the manor's corridors, now only 3 remained. Mrs. Hawthorne managed the household. Thomas Fletcher, at 69, maintained the grounds and stables with the help of his grandson on weekends. And young Mary, barely 18, came 3 times a week to help with the heaviest cleaning, though she rarely saw Lord Ashworth and had been instructed not to speak to him if she did. Edmund's days followed a pattern as predictable as the turning of the seasons. He rose at dawn, dressed in the same dark suits he'd worn for 2 decades, and descended to his study. There he would spend the morning reviewing correspondence related to his business interests. He owned shares in 3 textile mills, 2 shipping companies, and had investments in the railway expansion. The money continued to flow in, managed by solicitors in London who rarely required his direct attention. Lunch was brought to him at 1 o'clock, always the same meal, cold meat, bread, cheese, and whatever vegetables the kitchen garden still provided this late in the season. He ate without tasting, his mind elsewhere or perhaps nowhere at all. Afternoons he spent reading, though he could rarely recall what he'd read by evening. The library held thousands of volumes, collected by 3 generations of Ashworths, but Edmund found himself returning again and again to the same worn books, seeking something he could never quite name. In the evening, he would walk the portrait gallery on the 2nd floor. It was a ritual he'd maintained for 20 years, though he couldn't have said why. The gallery stretched the length of the Manor's east wing, its walls lined with paintings of Ashworth's past. There was his grandfather, stern in his judicial robes, his grandmother, beautiful and severe, his parents side by side, painted shortly before their deaths in a carriage accident when Edmund was 25. And there, at the end of the gallery, hung the portrait that drew him every night. Eleanor, at 23, painted in the first year of their marriage. The artist had captured something essential about her, the brightness in her eyes that spoke of an unquenchable curiosity about the world. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair unpinned and falling around her shoulders in a way that had scandalized some of the older relatives. In her hands, she held a book, because Eleanor was always reading, always learning, always questioning. Edmund would stand before that portrait for exactly 10 minutes each evening, neither more nor less. He never spoke, never wept, never touched the painted surface. He simply stood and looked, as if the act of witnessing might somehow keep her memory alive, might somehow make up for all the ways he'd failed her. The village of Ashworth below lay at the foot of the hill, a collection of stone cottages and shops that had served the manor for generations. The villagers respected Edmund, or at least they respected his wealth and position. When he passed through on his rare visits to conduct business at the bank, they tipped their hats and stepped aside. The shopkeepers offered their finest goods and never argued about price. But there was no warmth in these exchanges, no real connection. Mrs. Pemberton at the bakery remembered the old Edmund, the one who'd laughed and joked and seemed to genuinely care about the lives of ordinary people. She would sometimes send an extra loaf of bread up to the manor with Thomas, along with a note expressing hope that Lord Ashworth was well. These notes went unanswered, but she continued sending them anyway, a small act of faith that somewhere inside the cold lord was the warm young man she'd once known. The vicar, Reverend Matthews, had tried for years to draw Edmund back to the church. Eleanor had been devout, attending services every Sunday, and involving herself in charitable work throughout the parish. After her death, Edmund had simply stopped coming. The Reverend had called at the manor dozens of times in those first years, offering comfort, prayer, and fellowship. Edmund had received him politely, listened without comment, and declined every invitation. Eventually, the visits had tapered off, though the Reverend still included Lord Ashworth in his prayers each Sunday. There were rumors, of course. In a village as small as Ashworth below, there were always rumors. Some said Lord Ashworth had gone mad with grief. Others whispered that he'd made some dark bargain, trading his humanity for wealth. A few of the older women claimed to have seen lights in the manor's tower at strange hours, suggesting occult practices. These stories were nonsense, but they persisted because they offered an explanation for something the villagers couldn't otherwise understand: how a man could simply stop living while his heart still beat. Thomas Fletcher knew better. He'd known Edmund since the Lord was a boy, had taught him to ride and fish and shoot. He'd watched the transformation after Eleanor's death with a grief of his own. Thomas understood that Edmund hadn't stopped living by choice. The man had simply broken, and breaking isn't something you can will yourself through. It's something you survive or you don't. Thomas still made efforts, small ones, to remind Edmund of who he'd been. He would mention the gardens Eleanor had loved, suggesting new plantings for spring. He would speak of village children who might benefit from apprenticeships on the estate. He would leave the newspaper open to articles about social reforms, knowing Edmund had once cared deeply about such things. These attempts rarely produced visible results, but Thomas persisted with the patience of a man who understood that healing, when it comes at all, comes slowly. Mrs. Hawthorne had her own methods, though they were harder to discern. She maintained Eleanor's rooms exactly as they'd been, dusting and airing them weekly despite Edmund's instructions to close them off. She prepared meals using Eleanor's favorite recipes, hoping the familiar tastes might stir something in him. She kept fresh flowers in the entry hall, even in winter when they were expensive and difficult to obtain, because Eleanor had believed a home without flowers was a home without hope. But if these small rebellions registered with Edmund, he gave no sign. He moved through each day like a man following a script he'd memorized long ago, playing a part that required nothing of him but presence, the passion that had once animated him, the curiosity that had drawn him to Eleanor in the first place, the ambition that had driven him to expand his family's holdings. All of it had drained away, leaving only the hollow form of a man. The study where Edmund spent his mornings was perhaps the most revealing room in the manor. Unlike the rest of the house, which maintained a careful order, the study showed signs of actual use. Papers lay scattered across the massive oak desk. Books stood in crooked stacks on every surface. The fire was kept burning here, the only room besides Edmund's bedroom where warmth was considered necessary. On the wall behind the desk hung a map of the county, marked with the locations of Edmund's various holdings. Pins indicated the mills, the warehouses, the properties he rented to tenant farmers. It was an impressive display of wealth and influence, the accumulated success of careful management and shrewd investment. Yet Edmund rarely looked at it anymore. The business continued because systems were in place, because good managers ran the day-to-day operations, because momentum carried things forward even when the man at the center had lost interest. A smaller desk in the corner held something more personal. It was Eleanor's writing desk, moved here after her death. Edmund had been unable to bring himself to go through her papers, to sort her correspondence, and dispose of the personal items that no longer served any purpose. So the desk sat undisturbed, a shrine to incompletion, holding letters she'd never finished, notes for charitable projects she'd never completed, sketches she'd made of the child she'd expected to raise. Edmund never touched the desk, but he'd positioned his chair so that he could see it while he worked. It was a form of penance, perhaps, or simply an acknowledgement that Eleanor's absence was more present to him than any living thing. December had arrived with its usual promise of hardship. The countryside around Thornfield was beautiful but unforgiving in winter. Snow came early to the hills and stayed late. The road to the village often became impassable, leaving the manor isolated for days or even weeks at a time. Edmund didn't mind. Isolation suited him. He had provisions enough, fuel enough, and no desire for company. This particular winter was shaping up to be especially harsh. Old farmers in the village spoke of signs, the thickness of animal fur, the early migration of birds, the behavior of insects in autumn. Thomas had laid in extra firewood and ensured the manor's stores were fully stocked. Mrs. Hawthorne had preserved more than usual from the summer harvest, filling the cellar with jars of vegetables and fruits that would last until spring. On this December evening, as Edmund made his customary walk through the portrait gallery, he noticed the wind picking up outside. Snow had been falling since morning, light flurries that danced past the windows. Now the flurries were thickening into something more substantial. By the time he reached Eleanor's portrait, he could hear the wind howling around the manor's corners, rattling the old windows in their frames. The manor stood against the winter sky like a monument to solitude. Thornfield Manor, they called it, though few in the village below ever spoke its name without a certain reverence, or perhaps it was fear. The estate sprawled across the hillside, its stone walls gray and imposing, its windows dark even in daylight. Smoke rose from a single chimney, a thin thread of evidence that someone still lived within those cold walls. Lord Edmund Ashworth had not always been a ghost in his own home. There were those in the village who remembered a different man, a younger man with kind eyes and ready laughter. Mrs. Pemberton at the bakery still spoke of the day he'd carried her groceries through a spring rain, refusing payment and joking about the weather. Thomas Fletcher, who tended the manor's grounds, could recall summer afternoons when Edmund would roll up his sleeves and work alongside the staff, talking of plans for the future with an enthusiasm that made everyone around him believe in possibilities. But that was before. Before the winter 20 years passed when Eleanor Ashworth had gone into labor on a December night much like this one. Before the midwife's worried whispers and the doctor's grim pronouncements. Before the silence that fell over the manor when the crying stopped, when both mother and child were lost in a single terrible night. Edmund was 58 now, though he looked older. His hair had gone silver, not gradually but seemingly all at once in the months following Eleanor's death. His face, once open and warm, had set into lines of careful neutrality. He moved through the vast rooms of Thornfield, like a man walking through a museum, observing but not touching, present but not living. The manor itself reflected its master's state. In Eleanor's time, every room had buzzed with life. Fresh flowers adorned the tables. Curtains were drawn back to let in light. Fires crackled in multiple hearths. Music had drifted from the piano in the drawing room, where Eleanor would play in the evenings while Edmund read aloud from whatever book had captured her interest that week. Now the drawing room stood empty, the piano's keys untouched and slowly falling out of tune. Dust sheets covered furniture in rooms that hadn't seen visitors in years. The dining hall, which had once hosted gatherings of 24 or more, set a table for one each evening. Edmund took his meals in silence, served by Mrs. Hawthorne, the housekeeper who had been with the family since Edmund was a boy. Mrs. Hawthorne was 73, her back bent from decades of service, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of both joy and sorrow. She had loved Eleanor like a daughter, and grieved her loss almost as deeply as Edmund had. But where Edmund had turned inward, Mrs. Hawthorne had grown harder, her warmth cooling into efficiency. She ran the household with stern precision, keeping the staff at a distance and discouraging any familiarity. In the evening, Edmund would walk the portrait gallery on the second floor. It was a ritual he'd maintained for 20 years. The gallery stretched the length of the manor's east wing, its walls lined with paintings of Ashworth's past. And there, at the end of the gallery, hung the portrait that drew him every night. Eleanor at 23, painted in the first year of their marriage. The artist had captured something essential about her, the brightness in her eyes that spoke of an unquenchable curiosity about the world. She wore a simple blue dress, her dark hair unpinned and falling around her shoulders. In her hands, she held a book, because Eleanor was always reading, always learning, always questioning. Edmund would stand before that portrait for exactly 10 minutes each evening, neither more nor less. He never spoke, never wept, never touched the painted surface. He simply stood and looked, as if the act of witnessing might somehow keep her memory alive. On this December evening, as Edmund made his customary walk through the portrait gallery, he noticed the wind picking up outside. Snow had been falling since morning, light flurries that danced past the windows. Now the flurries were thickening into something more substantial. By the time Edmund descended to his study after dinner, the storm had transformed from a gentle snowfall into something far more menacing. Wind shrieked around the manor's stone walls, driving snow against the windows with such force that it sounded like sand being hurled at glass. Edmund settled into his leather chair and opened the ledger his London solicitor had sent, but the numbers blurred before his eyes. The storm's fury made concentration impossible. Mrs. Hawthorne appeared at the door with a tray of tea. "A terrible night, my lord," she said, setting the tray on his desk. "Thomas has secured the stables and checked all the shutters. We're sealed up tight." Edmund nodded his thanks and she withdrew. He sipped the tea, finding it had gone cold during her brief speech. The clock on the mantel showed 10:30. He should retire soon, though sleep rarely came easily these days. Then he heard it. A sound so faint he thought at first he'd imagined it. A knocking, barely audible over the storm's roar. He set down his teacup and listened. There it was again, weak and irregular, as if whoever stood outside lacked the strength to knock properly. Edmund rose and moved into the hallway. The knocking continued, growing slightly more insistent. He called for Mrs. Hawthorne, and she emerged from the kitchen corridor, her face puzzled. "Someone's at the door," Edmund said. In this storm, Mrs. Hawthorne's expression shifted from puzzlement to concern. "At this hour? In this weather?" She moved past him toward the great entrance hall, Edmund following. Thomas appeared from the servants' quarters, pulling on his coat. The knocking came again, and now they could all hear it clearly. Mrs. Hawthorne reached the door first, drawing back the heavy bolt. The wind caught the door as she opened it, nearly tearing it from her hands. Thomas rushed forward to help her hold it. On the doorstep stood 5 children. They were huddled together against the cold, their thin clothes crusted with ice and snow. The oldest, A girl of perhaps 14 stood at the front, one arm around a small boy who could barely stand. Behind them clustered 3 others, their faces blue with cold, their eyes huge with exhaustion and fear. "Please," the girl said, her voice cracking. "Please, sir. We've nowhere else to go." Mrs. Hawthorne made a sound of dismay. Edmund stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Children. 5 children, half dead from cold, on his doorstep in the middle of a winter storm. "We walked from Grimsby," the girl continued, her words tumbling out between chattering teeth. 3 days, the workhouse. There was sickness. They were dying. We had to leave. She swayed on her feet, and Edmund saw that she was holding the small boy upright, as much as he was leaning on her. "We heard," she said, and her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "We heard you were kind once, that you helped people. Please, sir, be our father before we die here." The words struck Edmund like a physical blow. The small boy in the girl's arms had dark hair, matted with snow. His face, what Edmund could see of it, was thin and pale. For one impossible moment, Edmund saw another child, one he'd never known, one who'd been taken from him before he could even hold him. "Get them inside," he heard himself say. "Now, before they freeze to death on our doorstep." Thomas and Mrs. Hawthorne sprang into action. Thomas lifted the small boy into his arms, while Mrs. Hawthorne guided the others through the door. Edmund stepped back as they filed past him, leaving puddles of melting snow on the marble floor. The oldest girl was the last to enter. She looked up at Edmund, and he saw in her eyes a mixture of hope and terror, as if she couldn't quite believe they'd been allowed inside, but feared at any moment they'd be cast back out into the storm. "Thank you," she whispered. Then her eyes rolled back and she collapsed. Edmund caught her before she hit the floor, shocked by how light she was, how fragile. He could feel her bones through the thin, wet fabric of her dress. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Prepare the rooms in the East Wing. Hot water, blankets, food. Thomas, ride for Dr. Pemberton. I don't care about the storm. These children need a doctor now." The East Wing came alive with activity for the first time in 20 years. Mrs. Hawthorne moved with surprising speed for her age, directing young Mary, who'd been roused from her cottage, to help. They stripped the dust covers from beds, built fires in cold hearths, and hauled pails of hot water up the stairs. Edmund found himself in the midst of it all, carrying blankets and stoking fires, his hands remembering work they hadn't done in decades. The children were brought up one by one. Thomas had returned with Dr. Pemberton, a stout man of 60 who'd braved the storm without complaint. He examined each child in turn, his face growing grimmer with each assessment. "Severe malnutrition," he said to Edmund in a low voice. "Exposure, certainly. The 3 middle children have pneumonia. I'd wager my practice on it. The oldest girl, the one who collapsed, she's burning with fever. And the little one." He paused, shaking his head. "The little one hasn't spoken a word, just stares. I've seen that look before, in soldiers back from war. Something terrible happened to him." Edmund stood in the hallway outside the rooms where the children lay, listening to the doctor's diagnosis. "Will they live?" he asked. "That depends," Dr. Pemberton said. "On care, warmth, proper food. On whether whatever illness the oldest girl has is consumption or something that will pass. On whether the little one's spirit is too broken to mend." He fixed Edmund with a direct look. "It depends on whether they have a reason to fight. Children who've been through what these have, they sometimes just give up." After the doctor left, promising to return in the morning, Edmund found himself standing in the doorway of the room where the oldest girl slept. Mrs. Hawthorne had cleaned her, dressed her in one of Eleanor's old nightgowns, and tucked her into bed. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, and in the firelight, she looked even younger than 14. "Her name is Catherine," Mrs. Hawthorne said softly, appearing at Edmund's elbow. "She told me before the fever took her fully. The boy who wouldn't speak is William. Then there's James, he's 12. Margaret is 10. Samuel is 8. She paused. "They came from Grimsby workhouse. There was an outbreak of fever. Children dying. The master wouldn't call a doctor. Said it was too expensive. Catherine gathered these 4 and they ran. 3 days in this weather," Edmund murmured. "How did they survive?" They slept in barns, begged food from farms. Catherine told the little ones stories to keep them moving. She promised them they'd find a place where someone would care. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice cracked slightly. She told them about you, my lord. About how you used to be. Edmund felt something twist in his chest. I'm not that man anymore. Perhaps not, Mrs. Hawthorne said. But you let them in. That's a start. Over the next 3 days, Edmund found himself drawn into rhythms he'd forgotten existed. The children needed care every few hours, broth and medicine and cool cloths for fevers. He took turns with Mrs. Hawthorne and Thomas sitting with them through the nights. He learned their faces in lamplight, their different ways of sleeping, the sounds they made when nightmares troubled them. James, the 12-year-old, woke on the second day. His first words were, "When are you sending us back?" His eyes were hard, defensive. He'd been disappointed before. "You're not going back," Edmund said. "Everyone says that," James replied. "Then morning comes and we're out on our ears." Edmund had no answer that would convince the boy, so he simply sat beside the bed until James fell asleep again. Margaret, the 10-year-old, discovered the Manor's library on the 3rd day when she was well enough to walk. Edmund found her standing in the doorway, her eyes wide with wonder at the shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. "You can read any of them," Edmund said. She turned to him, suspicious. "Truly?" "Truly." She selected a volume of fairy tales, holding it as if it were made of gold. Samuel, the 8-year-old, followed Thomas everywhere once his fever broke, asking questions about the horses, the grounds, the village below. His curiosity was relentless, exhausting, and somehow comforting. But William, the youngest, remained silent. He sat in his bed, clutching a blanket, his dark eyes watching everything but engaging with nothing. The first week passed in a blur of small crises and smaller victories. Catherine's fever broke on the 5th day, leaving her weak but lucid. She insisted on getting out of bed despite the doctor's protests, driven by a need to check on the others. Edmund watched her move from room to room, this 14-year-old girl who'd taken responsibility for 4 other lives, and felt something inside him begin to thaw. "You should rest," he told her as she sat by William's bed, stroking the boy's hair. "I've rested enough," she said. "He needs to know I'm here, that I didn't leave him." "I won't send you away," Edmund said. The words came easier each time he spoke them. Catherine looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "People always mean well at first," she said quietly. "Then they remember we're just workhouse children, that we're trouble, that we cost money and bring shame." Edmund had no response to that, because he knew she was right. He'd seen it himself in the village, the way people treated those without means or family. He'd turned a blind eye to it for 20 years. That evening, Edmund went to his study and opened the cabinet where he kept items too precious to discard, but too painful to display. Inside was a small wooden box, and inside that was a toy soldier he'd carved years ago. He'd made it for the son he'd thought he'd have, whittling it by candlelight while Eleanor slept in the final weeks of her pregnancy. After her death, he'd put it away and tried to forget it existed. Now he carried it to William's room. The boy was awake, staring at the ceiling as he did most hours. Edmund sat on the edge of the bed and placed the soldier on the blanket. "I made this a long time ago," Edmund said, "for someone who never got to play with it. I think it's been waiting for you." William's eyes shifted to the toy. Slowly, tentatively, his small hand reached out and picked it up. He turned it over, examining it. Then he looked at Edmund, and for the first time, something flickered in those empty eyes. "Thank you," William whispered. 2 words, barely audible, but they were the first he'd spoken since arriving. Edmund felt his throat tighten. "You're welcome, son." The word hung in the air between them. Son. Edmund hadn't meant to say it, but once spoken, it felt right in a way nothing had felt right for 20 years. James remained the hardest to reach. He tested boundaries constantly, taking food from the kitchen without asking, disappearing into unused rooms, once trying to leave the manor entirely before Thomas found him at the gate. When Edmund confronted him, James's face was a mask of defiance. "I was just seeing if you'd come after me," James said. "Seeing if you'd notice. I'd notice, Edmund said. I'd come after you. Why? James demanded. We're nothing to you. Just mouths to feed. Edmund thought about that. My wife died 20 years ago, he said finally. So did my child. I thought I died with them, in a way that matters. But you 5 showed up at my door and you didn't ask for much. Just for someone to care if you lived or died. I'm trying to learn how to care again. You'll have to be patient with me. James stared at him, suspicious, but something in his expression softened. You really mean that? I do. Margaret spent hours in the library, and Edmund found himself joining her there in the afternoons. They would sit in companionable silence, each with a book. Sometimes she would ask him questions about words she didn't know, and he would explain. Once she asked him to read aloud, and he found himself performing the different character voices as he'd once done for Eleanor. Samuel's endless questions drove Edmund to think about things he'd ignored for years. Why did the stars move? Where did the stream that crossed the property lead? What had Edmund's father been like? The boy's curiosity was infectious, reminding Edmund that the world was still full of wonders if one chose to see them. Catherine watched all of this with cautious hope. Edmund would catch her observing him with the others, measuring, assessing. She was protecting them still, ready to gather them up and run if he proved false. He understood. Trust had to be earned, especially from children who'd been given every reason not to trust. The letter arrived on a gray morning 2 weeks after the children had come to Thornfield. Edmund recognized the seal immediately, the crest of Whitmore and Sons, his London solicitors. They handled his business affairs and rarely contacted him unless absolutely necessary. He opened it expecting some mundane matter of contracts or investments. Instead, he found himself staring at words that made no sense. He read them once, twice, 3 times, each reading bringing a fresh wave of shock that left him gripping the edge of his desk. Mrs. Hawthorne found him an hour later, still sitting with the letter in his hands, his face ashen. "My lord, are you unwell?" "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse. "She left a letter. Her family kept it all these years. They've only just sent it to the solicitors." Mrs. Hawthorne moved closer, her concern deepening. "What does it say?" Edmund looked up at her, and she saw something she hadn't seen in his eyes for 20 years. Raw, unguarded emotion. She knew she was dying. She wrote it before the birth, in case. She wanted me to know. He paused, struggling with the words. She didn't want me to shut myself away from the world. She begged me not to let grief destroy my capacity to love. "Oh, my lord," Mrs. Hawthorne whispered. But Edmund wasn't finished. "There's more. The baby. Our son." He had to stop, had to force the next words out. "He didn't die." Mrs. Hawthorne went very still. "What?" "Eleanor's family took him. They blamed me for her death. They took the child and told me he'd died with her. They placed him in an orphanage." Edmund's hands were shaking. "My son lived. He's been alive all this time. 20 years. The revelation hung between them like a physical presence. Mrs. Hawthorne sank into a chair, her face pale. "Do they know where he is now?" "No." Edmund's voice was hollow. "The orphanage records are incomplete. Children were moved, sent to workhouses, apprenticed out. The trail goes cold after a few years. He could be anywhere. He could be dead. He could have passed through a dozen institutions." He looked at Mrs. Hawthorne with eyes that held a terrible understanding. He could have been in places like Grimsby Workhouse. The implications of that settled over them both. Edmund rose and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where Samuel was helping Thomas clear snow from the paths. "I had a son," he said quietly. "All these years I had a son, and I never knew. I never looked for him because I thought he was dead, and somewhere he was alone, thinking no one wanted him." "You didn't know," Mrs. Hawthorne said. "You can't blame yourself for not knowing, can I?" Edmund turned back to her. "I shut myself away. I stopped caring about the world beyond these walls. While I was here feeling sorry for myself, my son was out there, and I did nothing. I was nothing." He moved to the door, then paused. "Catherine said she knew children from other workhouses, that the system moved them around. She might have known him. My son might have been in the same hell she escaped from." He pressed his hand against the doorframe. "These 5 children, they came here asking me to be their father. And I have a son somewhere who needed a father and never had one. Do you see? This is my chance. Not to replace him, not to forget, but to save the children I can save, to be for them what I couldn't be for him. Mrs. Hawthorne rose and came to stand beside him. Then that's what you'll do, my lord. You'll give these children what your son never had, and perhaps, in some way, that will honor both him and Eleanor's memory. Edmund nodded slowly. The grief was still there, fresh and raw as the day Eleanor died, but now it was joined by something else. Purpose, direction, a reason to step forward instead of remaining frozen in the past. That evening he gathered the children in the library. They sat in a half-circle before the fire, their faces uncertain. Edmund had never called them together like this before. "I need to tell you something," he began, "about why you're here, about why I'm going to make sure you never have to leave." Edmund sat at his desk, the adoption papers spread before him like a battle plan. His solicitor in London had been clear. The process would not be simple. A single man of 58 adopting 5 children with no blood relation to him would raise questions, objections, and considerable scandal. But Edmund had made his decision, and once made, he pursued it with the same determination that had built his fortune. The village had already begun to talk. Whispers reached the manor through Thomas, through the tradesmen who delivered supplies, through young Mary who heard everything at the market. Lord Ashworth had taken in workhouse orphans. Lord Ashworth had gone soft in the head. Lord Ashworth was making a mockery of his position and his family name. The opposition became official when Lord Weatherby, the local magistrate, called at Thornfield on a cold January morning. He was a portly man with impressive whiskers and an even more impressive sense of his own importance. "Ashworth," he said, settling into the chair across from Edmund's desk without invitation, "we need to discuss this situation with the children." "There is no situation," Edmund replied calmly. "I'm adopting them. The papers are being prepared. That's what I'm here about." Weatherby leaned forward. "You can't be serious. 5 children? From a workhouse? Think of your reputation. Think of your family name." "I am thinking of my family," Edmund said. "These children are my family now." Weatherby's face reddened. "You're unmarried. You're approaching 60. You have no experience with children. The courts will never approve this madness. Then I'll appeal to higher courts. You'll be laughed out of every courthouse in England." Weatherby stood, his voice rising. "I'm telling you as a friend and as magistrate, abandon this foolishness. Send the children to a proper institution where they belong." Edmund rose as well, his voice quiet but carrying a steel Weatherby hadn't heard before. "They belong here, with me, and I will fight anyone who tries to take them away." But Weatherby's visit was only the beginning. 3 days later, a carriage arrived bearing Mr. Grimshaw, the master of Grimsby Workhouse. He was a thin man with cold eyes and hands that moved constantly, as if always counting coins. "Lord Ashworth," he said, his voice oily with false deference, "I've come about the children who absconded from my establishment." "They didn't abscond," Edmund said. "They escaped. There's a difference." Grimshaw's smile didn't reach his eyes. "A legal distinction, I'm sure. But the fact remains, they are bound to the workhouse until they reach majority. I have every right to demand their return. You have no such right. I have the law, my lord." Grimshaw produced a document. "These children are wards of the parish. The workhouse has legal custody. If you refuse to return them, I'll have no choice but to pursue the matter through the courts." Edmund took the document, read it carefully, then handed it back. "Pursue whatever you wish. These children aren't going anywhere." After Grimshaw left, Edmund sat alone in his study. The legal obstacles were mounting. Weatherby's opposition meant the local courts would be hostile. Grimshaw's claim of legal custody was problematic, and there were other considerations he hadn't anticipated. The children would need tutors, clothing, proper medical care. The village would ostracize them. His business associates were already sending letters questioning his judgment. But the worst came that evening when Dr. Pemberton requested a private word. They stood in Edmund's study, and the doctor's face was grave. "It's Catherine," he said. "The fever that brought her down when they first arrived. It wasn't just exposure and exhaustion." "What are you saying?" "Consumption, Edmund, tuberculosis, advanced stage. I've seen it too many times not to recognize it." Edmund felt the floor shift beneath him. "How long?" "Weeks, maybe months if we're fortunate." "I'm sorry." After the doctor left, Edmund climbed the stairs to Catherine's room. She was awake, reading by lamplight. She looked up as he entered, and he saw that she already knew. Of course she knew. She'd probably known since before they arrived at Thornfield. "You're going to fight for us anyway," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Even though I'm dying." Edmund sat beside her bed. "Especially because you're dying. You deserve to spend whatever time you have in a home, Catherine, as part of a family. You all do." Christmas Eve morning arrived with crystalline cold and a summons to court. The hearing had been scheduled for 10 o'clock, an unusual time that spoke to the pressure Lord Weatherby was applying. Edmund dressed carefully, aware that appearance would matter in the proceedings. Before leaving his room, he touched the wooden soldier in his pocket, the twin to the one he'd given William. A reminder of what he was fighting for. Catherine insisted on attending. Despite Dr. Pemberton's protests, "I need to be there," she said, her voice firm even as her body trembled with weakness. "They need to hear from me." The courthouse in Ashworth below was packed. News of the hearing had spread through the village and beyond. Curious faces filled the gallery, some sympathetic, many hostile. Edmund helped Catherine to a chair near the front. Her brothers and sister clustered protectively around her. Lord Weatherby presided, his face set in stern lines. Mr. Grimshaw sat at the prosecutor's table looking satisfied. The proceedings began with Grimshaw presenting his case. His voice was smooth, reasonable, painting Edmund as a rich man's whim, the children as property of the parish that must be returned. "Lord Ashworth has no experience with children," Grimshaw argued. "He is unmarried, aging, and by his own admission has lived in isolation for 20 years. These children require structure, discipline, and proper Christian instruction that only an institution can provide." Lord Weatherby nodded along, clearly in agreement. Edmund's solicitor, a sharp young man named Morrison from London, rose to object, but Weatherby waved him down. Then it was Edmund's turn. He stood, feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. "I won't pretend to be perfect," he began. "I won't claim to know everything about raising children. 20 years ago, I lost my wife and the son I thought had died with her. I spent 2 decades convinced that my life was over, that I had nothing left to give the world." He paused, looking at the children. "Then 5 children appeared at my door in a snowstorm, asking me to be their father before they died. And I realized something. I'd been dead all this time, not them. They were fighting to live. They'd walk 3 days through winter to find someone who might care." Edmund turned to address Weatherby directly. "You say I have no experience with children. You're right, but I've learned something these past weeks. James here taught me that trust must be earned through consistency, not words. Margaret showed me that a love of learning can flourish anywhere if given the chance. Samuel reminded me that curiosity about the world is a gift, not a burden. William, who hadn't spoken in months, learned to speak again because someone finally gave him a reason to." He moved to stand beside Catherine's chair, and Catherine taught me the most important lesson. She's 14 years old, and she's been more of a parent to these children than most adults ever manage. She's dying, Lord Weatherby. Consumption. Dr. Pemberton will confirm it. She has weeks, maybe months, and Mr. Grimshaw wants to send her back to a workhouse to die among strangers, unloved and unmourned. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Grimshaw half rose in protest, but Edmund continued. "I'm not asking for the right to be their father because I'm perfect. I'm asking because I love them, because they've given me a reason to live again, because every child deserves to be wanted and I want them." Catherine stood then, swaying slightly. James and Margaret steadied her. "May I speak?" she asked. Weatherby looked uncomfortable but nodded. "My lord," Catherine said, her voice carrying despite its weakness. "I've lived in 3 workhouses. I've seen children beaten, starved, worked until they couldn't stand. I've watched them die of fevers while the masters counted coins instead of calling doctors. When the sickness came to Grimsby, I knew we had to leave or we'd all die there." She paused, gathering strength. "I brought them to Lord Ashworth because I'd heard stories from old servants about the man he used to be. I gambled that somewhere inside him, that man still existed. I was right. In 3 weeks, he's shown us more kindness than we've known in our entire lives. He's given us a home, not just a building. He's taught us that we matter, that our lives have value." Her voice broke. "I'm dying. I know that. But I want to die knowing that James, Margaret, Samuel, and William will be safe, that they'll grow up loved. Lord Ashworth can give them that. Please don't take this away from us. She collapsed back into the chair, coughing. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Weatherby called a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, people lingering to discuss what they'd witnessed. Edmund carried Catherine back to the carriage. Her breathing labored. Dr. Pemberton appeared with his bag, administering laudanum for the pain. "You shouldn't have let her come," the doctor said, but his tone held no real reproach. He understood why she'd needed to be there. They returned to Thornfield to wait. The children gathered in Catherine's room, none of them wanting to be alone. Edmund sat with them, reading aloud from one of Margaret's favorite books, though he suspected none of them were actually listening to the words. They were simply taking comfort in being together, whatever the outcome. Night fell. They lit candles and continued their vigil. Mrs. Hawthorne brought soup that no one ate. Thomas stood by the window, watching the road for any sign of a messenger. The clock struck 9, then 10, then 11. Just before midnight, they heard hoofbeats. Thomas rushed downstairs and returned moments later with Lord Weatherby himself. The magistrate looked tired, older than he had that morning. He removed his hat as he entered Catherine's room. "I've reached my decision," he said without preamble. "The adoption is approved. All 5 children. Full legal custody to Lord Edmund Ashworth, effective immediately." The silence that followed was profound. Then James let out a sound between a laugh and a sob. Margaret started crying. Samuel threw his arms around Edmund's waist. William clutched the wooden soldier and whispered, "We can stay, Papa?" Edmund found he couldn't speak. He simply nodded, pulling William close. Weatherby cleared his throat. "I was wrong, Ashworth. About you, about this. What Catherine said in that courtroom about the workhouses. I've been turning a blind eye to those conditions for years. It was easier not to look. But that girl made me look, made me see." He paused. "Grimshaw's claim has been dismissed. I've also initiated an investigation into conditions at his workhouse. The stories that came out after the hearing, once people started talking." He shook his head. "It should have been done years ago." After Weatherby left, they sat together in the quiet joy of victory. But it was tempered by Catherine's condition. Even in her happiness, she was fading. Edmund could see it in the gray pallor of her skin, the effort each breath required. "Catherine," he said gently, "there's something I want you to have." He drew from his pocket a simple silver cross on a delicate chain. "This was Eleanor's, my wife. She wore it every day. I want you to have it now. To know that you're as much my daughter as if you'd been born to me." Catherine's eyes filled with tears as he fastened it around her neck. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For giving them a home, for giving me a family to leave them with." "You're not leaving yet," Edmund said, though they both knew it was a kindness more than truth. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold. The children woke early, as children do on Christmas, and found that Edmund had arranged gifts for each of them. Simple things, practical things, but chosen with care. Books for Margaret, a pocket watch for James, a magnifying glass for Samuel's endless investigations. New clothes for all of them, well made and warm. They gathered around Catherine's bed to open their presents, and for a few hours death retreated enough to let joy in. They laughed and talked about the future. James spoke of learning to manage the estate. Margaret wanted to become a teacher. Samuel thought he might like to be a doctor like Pemberton. William said he wanted to stay with Papa forever. Catherine watched them all with fierce love and quiet satisfaction. At one point she caught Edmund's eye and mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." That afternoon, Catherine's fever broke. It happened so suddenly that at first they thought they'd imagined it, but Dr. Pemberton confirmed it. Her temperature had dropped, her breathing eased. She was still desperately ill, but she'd stabilized. "I've seen this before," Pemberton said cautiously. "Not often, but sometimes. The body rallies. With proper care, good food, rest, clean air, she might have more time than I thought. Months, certainly. Perhaps even years." Edmund looked down at Catherine, sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks. William was curled up beside her, the wooden soldier clutched in one hand. The others dozed in chairs around the room, exhausted by the emotional toll of the past days. He thought of Eleanor, Of the son he'd lost and found only in memory, of the 20 years he'd wasted in grief. And he thought of these 5 souls who'd stumbled into his life and reminded him what it meant to be human. Spring came to Thornfield Manor with a gentleness that seemed almost apologetic after the harsh winter. Snow melted from the hillsides, revealing green grass beneath. The stream that wound through the property rushed with meltwater, and the trees began to show the first hints of buds. It was as if the world itself was waking up, shaking off a long sleep. Catherine sat in the garden, wrapped in blankets despite the warming air. Her recovery had been slow but steady. The consumption still ravaged her lungs, and there were days when she couldn't leave her bed. But she'd survived the winter. Dr. Pemberton called it remarkable. Edmund called it miraculous. Catherine simply said she'd had a reason to keep fighting. The other children had flourished. James had taken to working with Thomas on the estate, learning about crop rotation and animal husbandry with the same intensity he'd once applied to survival. His defensive walls had come down, gradually replaced by a quiet confidence. He still tested boundaries occasionally, but now it was the normal rebellion of a boy becoming a man, not the desperate behavior of someone expecting abandonment. Margaret had transformed the Manor's library into her own kingdom. She spent hours there, not just reading but organizing, cataloging, making notes. Edmund had hired a tutor from the village, Mr. Hendricks, who came 3 times a week. He reported that Margaret was the finest student he'd ever taught, with a particular gift for literature and languages. She'd already mastered Latin basics and was pestering Edmund to let her learn Greek. Samuel's curiosity had found its outlet in the natural world. He collected specimens of plants, insects, and rocks, carefully labeling and organizing them in cabinets Edmund had purchased for him. Dr. Pemberton had taken the boy under his wing, teaching him basic anatomy and medical principles. Samuel declared regularly that he would be a great doctor someday and discover a cure for consumption, so Catherine would be completely well. William had become Edmund's shadow. The boy who'd arrived silent and traumatized now chattered constantly, asking questions, telling stories, laughing at things only 6-year-olds found funny. He called Edmund Papa without hesitation, and Edmund found that each time he heard it, something in his chest both ached and soared. This wasn't the son he'd lost, but William was his son nonetheless, chosen rather than born, loved completely. The village had slowly warmed to the arrangement. It helped that Edmund had used his influence to improve conditions at several workhouses in the region, that he'd funded a new school in Ashworth Below, that he'd become involved in local affairs again after 20 years of isolation. People remembered the man he'd been before Eleanor's death, and began to believe he might become that man again. Mrs. Hawthorne had softened in ways that surprised even her. She smiled now, truly smiled, when the children gathered for meals. She'd taken to baking their favorite treats, teaching Margaret her recipes, listening to Samuel's endless medical theories with patient attention. She'd told Edmund once, late at night over tea, that the manor felt alive again, that she felt alive again. Thomas had taken on new purpose as well. He taught James everything he knew about the land, about responsibility, about the quiet satisfaction of work well done. In James he saw a worthy successor, someone who would care for Thornfield long after Thomas was gone. On this particular spring afternoon, Edmund had arranged for a portrait artist from London to visit. The man, Mr. Whitmore, had set up his easel in the garden where the light was best. He positioned the family carefully. Edmund in the center, Catherine in a chair beside him with William on her lap. James and Margaret stood on Edmund's other side, Samuel kneeling in front with one of his rock specimens. "Hold still now," Whitmore instructed, but the children couldn't quite manage it. Samuel fidgeted. William giggled. Even James, trying to maintain dignity, cracked a smile when Margaret whispered something in his ear. Edmund looked at them, these 5 souls who'd stumbled into his life on a winter night and changed everything. He thought of Eleanor, of the letter she'd left begging him not to let grief destroy his capacity to love. He'd failed her for 20 years, but perhaps, finally, he was honoring her wish. "Mr. Whitmore," Edmund said, "paint us as we are. Not formal, not perfect, just a family." The artist nodded, understanding what was being asked. He would capture this moment, This family that had formed not from blood but from choice, from need, from love offered and accepted. As the session ended and the children scattered to their various pursuits, Catherine remained in the garden with Edmund. She touched the silver cross at her throat, Eleanor's cross, and looked up at him. "I used to think," she said quietly, "that the best I could hope for was to die with dignity, to keep the others safe until I couldn't anymore. I never imagined I'd die as someone's daughter, in a home, surrounded by family." "You're not dying today," Edmund said gently. "Today you're living," she smiled. "Yes, today I'm living." The manor behind them stood warm and welcoming in the afternoon sun, smoke rising from multiple chimneys, windows open to let in spring air. Inside, Margaret was reading to Mrs. Hawthorne. Samuel was showing Thomas a particularly interesting beetle. James was planning next season's crops. Edmund realized that somewhere along the way, without his noticing exactly when, Thornfield had stopped being a mausoleum and become a home. The children had saved him, yes, but perhaps he'd saved them too. Or perhaps they'd simply saved each other, which was what families did. The door that had once shut out the world, now opened to welcome it. The man who'd been frozen in grief for 20 years had learned to move forward again, and 5 children who'd had nothing had found everything they needed. Sometimes the family we need finds us when we've stopped looking for it. Sometimes redemption comes not through forgetting our pain, but through using it to understand others. Sometimes love is about second chances, about choosing every day to care, to try, to be present. Edmund watched Catherine doze in the spring sunshine. William's toy soldier still clutched in her hand even in sleep. He thought of the plea she'd made that first night. "Be our father before we die here." He'd thought then that it was about saving them. Now he understood it had been about saving each other. In the end, that's what they'd done. They'd saved each other. The weeks following the court's decision brought changes that rippled through both the manor and the village below. Edmund had won the legal battle, but he understood that winning the hearts of the community would take longer. Some villagers still whispered disapprovingly when the children appeared in church on Sundays. Others crossed the street to avoid acknowledging them. But there were also small kindnesses. Mrs. Pemberton always had an extra sweet for the children when they visited her bakery. And the blacksmith had taken to teaching Samuel about metalworking on Saturday afternoons. Edmund threw himself into being a proper father, with the same intensity he'd once applied to his business ventures. He established routines, set rules, created structure. Breakfast at 8, lessons with Mr. Hendricks from 9 until noon, free time in the afternoon, family dinner at 6. The children tested these boundaries, of course. James stayed out past curfew twice. Margaret snuck books to read by candlelight when she should have been sleeping. Samuel conducted an experiment in the kitchen that resulted in a minor explosion and Mrs. Hawthorne's stern lecture about safety. But these were normal problems, the kind that families everywhere navigated. Edmund found himself consulting Thomas and Mrs. Hawthorne constantly, seeking advice on discipline, education, and the 1,000 small decisions that came with raising children. He made mistakes regularly. He was too lenient one day, too strict the next. He forgot that William was afraid of thunder until a spring storm sent the boy running to his room in tears. He didn't realize Margaret felt overshadowed by Catherine's illness until he found her crying in the library, feeling guilty for being healthy. Learning to be a father at 58 was humbling work. But Edmund discovered something remarkable. The children were patient with his stumbling efforts. They understood he was learning, just as they were learning to be part of a family. When he apologized for missing Samuel's presentation about rock formations because he'd been dealing with business correspondence, Samuel simply said, "It's all right. Papa, you can watch next time." That simple forgiveness moved Edmund more than he could express. Catherine's health remained precarious. She had good days when she could walk in the garden, help Margaret with her studies, and laugh at William's antics. But there were also bad days when the coughing fits left her exhausted and breathless, when pain creased her young face, when Edmund sat beside her bed through the night, holding her hand and praying to a God he'd stopped believing in 20 years ago. On one of her good days, Catherine asked Edmund to walk with her to the portrait gallery. She moved slowly, leaning on his arm, but she was determined. They stood before Eleanor's portrait, Catherine studying the painted face with quiet intensity. "She's beautiful," Catherine said finally. "You must have loved her very much." "I did," Edmund replied. "I still do." "Do you think she'd approve of us?" "Of what you've done?" Edmund looked at Eleanor's painted eyes, remembering the woman she'd been. Curious, compassionate, always advocating for those without power or voice. "I think she'd have brought you in from that storm before I'd even made it to the door," he said. "I think she'd have loved you all immediately and completely, the way she loved everyone." Catherine was quiet for a moment. "I'm glad you told me about your son, about how he was taken from you. It helps me understand why you said yes to us, when most people would have said no." "You helped me understand something too," Edmund said. "I spent 20 years mourning what I'd lost. But you 5, you showed me that love doesn't have to be about blood. That family can be something you choose, something you build. My son is gone. I'll never know what happened to him, whether he suffered, whether he found any happiness. That grief will never fully leave me. But you've given me a chance to be the father I never got to be. That's a gift I can never repay." "You already have," Catherine said softly. "Every single day." They walked back to her room slowly, and Edmund helped her settle into bed. As he turned to leave, she called him back. "Papa," she said, and it was the first time she'd used that word. "When I'm gone, and I will be gone someday soon, promise me you won't go back to how you were before. Promise me you'll keep living. For them." Edmund felt his throat tighten. "I promise. But you're not leaving yet. We still have time." "I know," Catherine said, touching the silver cross at her throat. "I just needed to hear you say it. I needed to know they'd be all right." "They will be. We all will be." Spring deepened into early summer, and with it came an unexpected visitor. Edmund was in the garden with William, teaching the boy to identify different plants, when Mrs. Hawthorne appeared at the door with a troubled expression. "My lord, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says it's about the children, about the workhouse system." Edmund felt a familiar tension grip his chest. He'd thought the legal battles were behind them. "Show him to the study. I'll be there directly." The man waiting in Edmund's study was perhaps 40, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers. He introduced himself as Mr. Albert Cunningham, a journalist from London working on an article about workhouse conditions. "Lord Ashworth," Cunningham began, "I've been investigating institutions across England. Your case came to my attention through Lord Weatherby's inquiry into Grimsby Workhouse. What I found there—" He paused, his face grim. "It's worse than anyone imagined. The abuse, the neglect, children dying of preventable diseases. But more than that, I found records." Edmund leaned forward. "What kind of records?" "Transfer records, lists of children moved between institutions over the past 20 years. I've been trying to trace them, to understand the scope of the problem." Cunningham pulled papers from his satchel. "When I learned about your situation, about your lost son, I thought perhaps I might help. I've spent the last 2 months going through archives." Edmund's heart began to pound. "And I found a child matching the description and timing. Born here at Thornfield, December 1805. Mother deceased, listed as Eleanor Ashworth. Infant transferred to Whitmore Orphanage in London under the name John Ashworth." The room seemed to tilt. Edmund gripped the edge of his desk. "Go on." From Whitmore, he was moved to 3 different institutions. The records become spotty after 1812. Apprenticed out to a mill owner in Manchester. After that, Cunningham spread his hands. "Nothing definitive. But I did find something interesting. A man named John Ashford, note the slight name change, operates a small printing shop in Liverpool. He's 32 years old. The age would be right. He told authorities when he established his business that he'd grown up in institutions, that he had no family." Edmund's hands were shaking. "This man, you think he might be my son?" "I think it's possible. The timeline fits. The name is close enough that it could be coincidence, or could be an attempt to distance himself from the past, while keeping some connection to his origins. I have his address if you want it." After Cunningham left, Edmund sat alone in his study for a long time. The address burned in his pocket like a brand. His son, possibly his son, alive, in Liverpool, a printer, a man with a trade and a business, who'd somehow survived the system that destroyed so many. But what right did Edmund have to disrupt that life? To appear after 30 years and claim a relationship he'd done nothing to earn? His son had grown up without him, believing himself unwanted and alone. What could Edmund possibly say that would make up for that? That evening, he gathered the children and explained the situation. They listened with wide eyes as he told them about Mr. Cunningham's discovery, about the man in Liverpool who might be their brother, the son Edmund had lost. "You have to go," James said immediately. "You have to find out if it's really him." "What if he doesn't want to know me?" Edmund asked. "What if I'm just a reminder of everything he lost?" Or, Margaret said quietly, what if he's been hoping his whole life that someone would come looking for him? Catherine, propped up with pillows in her chair, spoke with the wisdom that her illness had somehow accelerated. "Papa, you taught us that family is about choosing, about showing up even when it's hard. If this man is your son, he deserves the chance to choose whether to know you. But he can't make that choice if you never give him the option." Samuel nodded vigorously. "And if he is our brother, we want to meet him." William climbed into Edmund's lap. "Will you bring him home, Papa? Will he live with us?" "I don't know," Edmund said honestly. "I don't know what will happen. But you're right. I have to try. I owe him that much." The next morning, Edmund prepared for the journey to Liverpool. It would take 2 days by coach. Mrs. Hawthorne packed his bags while Thomas arranged for the horses. The children gathered to see him off, their faces a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "Bring him back, Papa," William said, hugging Edmund's legs. "Bring our brother home." Edmund bent down, meeting William's eyes. "I'll try, son. I promise I'll try." As the coach pulled away from Thornfield, Edmund looked back at the manor, at the 5 children waving from the steps. Whatever he found in Liverpool, whatever the truth turned out to be, he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't the same man who'd lost his son 30 years ago. He was someone different now, someone better, and he had these 5 extraordinary children to thank for that transformation. Liverpool smelled of salt and coal smoke, the docks alive with the shouts of workers loading ships bound for distant ports. Edmund's coach arrived in the afternoon, and he took rooms at a respectable inn near the city center. The address Cunningham had given him was in a modest commercial district, a street lined with small shops and businesses. Edmund stood outside the printing shop for a long time before entering. The sign above the door read, "Ashford Printworks, quality printing at fair prices." Through the window, he could see a man working at a press, his sleeves rolled up, his focus absolute. The man was tall, dark-haired, with a build that reminded Edmund of his own father. Finally, Edmund gathered his courage and pushed open the door. A bell chimed, and the man at the press looked up. His eyes were gray, startlingly familiar. "Eleanor's eyes. Can I help you, sir?" the man asked, wiping ink from his hands with a rag. Edmund found his voice had abandoned him. He cleared his throat. "Are you John Ashford?" "I am." "Are you here about a printing job?" "No, I'm here about you." Edmund paused, unsure how to proceed. "My name is Edmund Ashworth. I believe you may be my son." The color drained from John's face. He set down the rag slowly, carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might shatter something. "What did you say?" 30 years ago, my wife died giving birth. I was told our child died as well. Recently, I learned that wasn't true, that my son survived and was taken by my wife's family, placed in an orphanage. I've been searching for any trace of him." Edmund pulled out the papers Cunningham had compiled. "The records suggest you might be that child." John stared at him, his expression unreadable. "You're telling me you're my father? That you didn't abandon me, didn't know I existed? I thought you were dead. For 30 years, I thought you were dead." "I was in Whitmore Orphanage," John said, his voice flat. "Then Marchmont. Then Greystone. I was apprenticed to a mill owner who worked children 16 hours a day. 3 of the boys I knew died before they were 10. I ran away when I was 14, lived on the streets until a printer took pity on me and taught me the trade." He gestured around the shop. "This is what I built from nothing. No family, no help. Just me." Edmund felt each word like a blow. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. If I'd known—" "But you didn't know," John interrupted. "And I can't help but wonder why you're here now. What do you want from me?" "Nothing," Edmund said quickly. "I want nothing from you. I came because I needed to know if you were alive, if you were well, and because I thought you deserved to know the truth. That you weren't unwanted, that your mother loved you, that I would have raised you if I'd been given the chance." John laughed, a bitter sound. 30 years too late for that, I know. I know I have no right to ask anything of you. But I want you to know about your mother. Eleanor was remarkable. She was kind, brilliant, passionate about helping others. She would have adored you. And I want you to know you have brothers and sisters now, not by blood but by choice. 5 children I've adopted. They know about you. They wanted me to find you. Something flickered in John's eyes at that. You adopted children? From where? From a workhouse. They came to my door in a snowstorm, asking for help. One of them is dying. Consumption. But they're my children now, legally and in every way that matters. John was quiet for a long moment. You took in workhouse children. After what happened to me. Because of what happened to you, Edmund said. I spent 30 years dead inside, mourning what I'd lost. Those children reminded me how to live. They saved me, and in doing so, they made me realize that somewhere, my son might have needed someone to save him too, that I'd failed him by not looking, by giving up. I didn't need saving, John said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. I survived. You did more than survive. You built something, a business, a life. I'm proud of you, even though I have no right to be. John turned away, looking out the window at the street beyond. I used to imagine this, he said quietly. When I was small in the orphanage, I'd imagine my parents coming for me, explaining it had all been a mistake. As I got older, I stopped imagining. It hurt too much. I understand if you want me to leave. I'll go and I won't trouble you again. But I want you to have this. Edmund placed an envelope on the counter. It contains your mother's last letter, the one where she wrote about you, and my address at Thornfield Manor. If you ever want to know more, if you ever want to meet your brothers and sisters, the door is open. No expectations, no obligations, just an offer. John picked up the envelope but didn't open it. I need time to think about this. Of course. Take all the time you need. Edmund turned to leave, his heart heavy. He'd found his son, but the gulf between them seemed unbridgeable. Edmund returned to Thornfield 3 days later, exhausted and emotionally drained. The children met him at the door, their faces bright with expectation that dimmed when they saw he was alone. He didn't come with you? William asked, his disappointment plain. Edmund knelt down, pulling William close. He needs time to think. I can't blame him for that. I'm a stranger who appeared claiming to be his father after 30 years. That's a lot to accept. But you found him, Margaret said. He's alive. That's something? It is, Edmund agreed. It's more than I dared hope for. Over the following weeks, Edmund tried to settle back into the rhythms of life at Thornfield, but part of his mind remained in Liverpool, wondering if John would ever reach out. He threw himself into the children's education, working with Mr. Hendricks to develop individual curricula for each child. James was showing real aptitude for estate management and mathematics. Margaret's literary skills were advancing rapidly. Samuel had memorized half of Dr. Pemberton's medical texts. William was learning to read, sounding out words with fierce concentration. Catherine's condition remained stable, but fragile. She had more bad days than good now, spending most of her time in bed or in a chair by the window. But her spirit remained strong, and she took fierce joy in the accomplishments of her brothers and sister. One afternoon in late June, Edmund sat with Catherine in her room while she dozed. A knock came at the door, and Mrs. Hawthorne entered with an envelope. This just arrived by express post, my lord. From Liverpool. Edmund's hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was brief, written in a clear, precise hand. Lord Ashworth, I have read my mother's letter a dozen times. I have thought of little else these past weeks. I find I have questions I cannot answer on my own. If your offer still stands, I would like to visit Thornfield. I make no promises beyond that. But I would like to meet my brothers and sisters, and perhaps understand the man my father was meant to be. John Ashford. Edmund read the letter aloud to Catherine, his voice thick with emotion. She smiled, reaching for his hand. You see, I told you he deserved the choice. Now he's making it. The household erupted into preparation when Edmund announced John would be arriving in a week. Mrs. Hawthorne aired out the best guest room. Thomas ensured the grounds were immaculate. The children were beside themselves with excitement and nervousness. What if he doesn't like us? Samuel worried. What if he thinks we're strange? Margaret added. James, trying to maintain his dignity, said, We shouldn't get our hopes up. He's just visiting. He might leave and never come back. Or, Catherine said from her chair, he might find what we found. A family, a home, a place to belong. The day of John's arrival, the entire household was on edge. Edmund paced the entry hall. Mrs. Hawthorne rearranged flowers for the third time. The children stationed themselves at various windows watching the road. William saw the carriage first. He's here! Papa, he's here! Edmund stepped outside as the carriage pulled up. John emerged, looking uncertain and out of place in his simple but well-made clothes. For a moment, father and son simply looked at each other. Then Edmund extended his hand. Thank you for coming. John shook it, his grip firm. Thank you for inviting me. The children spilled out of the house, unable to contain themselves any longer. They surrounded John, a chorus of greetings and questions. Margaret introduced herself formally. Samuel immediately asked if John knew anything about chemistry. James hung back, assessing. William tugged at John's sleeve. Are you really our brother? John looked down at the small boy, at his earnest face and hopeful eyes, and something in his expression softened. I might be. I'd like to find out. Come meet Catherine, William said, taking John's hand with perfect trust. She's the oldest. She's sick, but she's really smart. She'll like you. John allowed himself to be led inside, glancing back once at Edmund. Their eyes met, and Edmund saw in his son's face a mixture of fear and hope that mirrored his own. This wasn't an ending. It wasn't even a beginning, not quite. It was a first step, tentative and uncertain, but a step nonetheless. Catherine was sitting up in bed when they brought John to her room. She studied him with the same measuring gaze she'd once turned on Edmund. You have her eyes, she said finally. Your mother's eyes. Edmund showed me her portrait, did he? John said, moving closer. What else did he tell you about her? That she was kind. That she fought for people who couldn't fight for themselves. That she would have loved you fiercely. Catherine smiled. I think you're like her. You survived things that should have broken you, and you built something good anyway. That takes strength, John's throat worked. I read her letter. The one she left. She wrote about hope. About believing people could change, could grow, could become better than they were. She was right, Catherine said. Look at Edmund, look at us. We're all proof of that. John stayed for 3 days that first visit. Edmund watched with careful restraint as his son explored the manor, met the staff, and slowly began to relax around the children. There were awkward moments. John wasn't accustomed to the noise and chaos of family life. At dinner the first night, when everyone talked over each other and Samuel knocked over his water glass, John looked overwhelmed. But there were good moments too. Margaret showed John the library, and they discovered a shared love of poetry. James took him to see the stables and the fields, explaining the work Thomas had taught him. Samuel peppered John with questions about printing presses and chemistry, until John finally laughed and said he'd need a week just to answer half of them. William attached himself to John immediately, following him everywhere with the wooden soldier clutched in his hand. John seemed bemused by the attention but not displeased. On the second afternoon, Edmund found them in the garden, William chattering away while John listened with patient attention. And Papa says when I'm bigger I can help with the horses, but right now I'm too small. But I'm growing. Catherine measures me every month and I've grown 2 inches since we came here. Do you like horses? I like horses. Thomas says they're noble animals and you have to respect them. John caught Edmund watching and gave him a small, uncertain smile. Edmund smiled back, not wanting to intrude, and walked on. That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Edmund invited John to his study. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, whiskey glasses in hand, the silence between them heavy with unspoken things. They're remarkable children, John said finally. Different from what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know. Damaged maybe. Broken. Like I was. John stared into his glass. But they're not. They're happy. They feel safe here. They didn't at first, Edmund said. It took time. Trust. Consistency. I made mistakes. I still make mistakes, but we're learning together. Why did you do it? John asked. Take them in. You didn't have to. Edmund considered the question. Catherine asked me to be their father before they died. And I looked at them and saw all the children I'd failed to help in 30 years of self-pity. I saw you, the son I'd lost. I saw a chance to do something that mattered. He paused, and I was so tired of being alone. John nodded slowly. I understand being alone. I've been alone my whole life. Even when I was surrounded by other orphans, I was alone. You learn not to trust, not to hope. You learn that people leave, that promises break, that the only person you can rely on is yourself. You don't have to be alone anymore, Edmund said quietly. Not if you don't want to be, don't I? John's voice held old pain. You have a family now. 5 children who need you, who love you. Where do I fit in that? I'm not a child anymore. I don't need a father. I built a life without one. You're right. You don't need a father. You're a grown man who's accomplished remarkable things on your own. Edmund leaned forward. But maybe you want one anyway. Maybe knowing where you came from, having people who share your blood and your history, maybe that matters even when you don't need it. John was quiet for a long time. I'm angry, he said finally. I know it's not logical. I know you didn't know. But I'm angry anyway, for every cold night, every empty stomach, every beating, every time I wondered why no one wanted me. I can't just let that go because you showed up with explanations and apologies. I don't expect you to, Edmund said. That anger is yours. You earned it. But I hope someday you might also find room for something else. Not forgiveness necessarily. Just connection. Just knowing you're not alone in the world anymore. I need more time, John said. This is all too much, too fast. Then take it. Come back. When you're ready. Or don't come back. Whatever you choose, I'll respect it. Edmund stood, moving to his desk. He retrieved a small leather portfolio and handed it to John. This belonged to your mother. Her sketches, some letters, photographs, they're yours now. John took the portfolio with reverent hands. Thank you. The next morning, John prepared to leave. The children gathered to say goodbye, their faces long with disappointment that he wasn't staying longer. William hugged John's legs fiercely. You'll come back, won't you? John hesitated, then bent down to the boy's level. I'll come back, he said, and seemed surprised by his own certainty. I promise. As the carriage pulled away, Catherine spoke from her chair by the window. He'll be one of us eventually. He just needs to believe it's real first. Edmund hoped she was right. But for now, it was enough that John had come at all, enough that he'd promised to return. Small steps were still steps forward. Summer reached its peak, bringing long golden days and warm evenings that stretched toward midnight. John returned to Thornfield twice more, staying longer each time. On his 3rd visit, he arrived with news that he'd hired a manager for his printing shop in Liverpool. He could stay for 2 weeks this time, perhaps longer. The children celebrated as if it were Christmas. Even James, who'd remained cautiously reserved around John, allowed himself to show genuine pleasure. They'd all been writing letters to John between visits, filling him in on daily life at the manor. Margaret had sent him poems she'd written. Samuel had drawn diagrams of a water pump he was designing. William had sent crayon drawings of the family, always including John even when he wasn't there. Edmund watched his son integrate more fully into the household rhythms. John began taking meals with them regularly, joining in the evening readings, helping James with mathematics, discussing literature with Margaret. He had a gentle patience with the younger children that surprised Edmund. For someone who'd grown up without family, John seemed to instinctively understand what they needed. One afternoon, Edmund found John sitting with Catherine in her room. Her condition had worsened noticeably in recent weeks. She tired easily now, and the coughing fits left her gasping, but her mind remained sharp, and she'd taken particular interest in John's story. Tell me about the printing shop, she was saying as Edmund paused in the doorway. How did you learn the trade? John's face softened as he spoke. There was a man named Mr. Fletcher. I was living on the streets in Liverpool, maybe 15 years old, stealing to survive. He caught me trying to take food from his shop. Instead of calling the constable, he asked if I was hungry. When I said yes, he fed me. Then he asked if I wanted to work. Said he needed an apprentice. He sounds like a good man, Catherine said. He was. He didn't ask about my past. Didn't care that I was a nobody from nowhere. He just taught me the trade, gave me a place to sleep, treated me with respect. When he died 3 years ago, he left me the shop, said I'd earned it. You did more than earn it, Catherine said. You honored his faith in you. That's what matters. John looked at her with something like wonder. How did you get so wise at 14? Nearly dying gives you perspective, Catherine said with a small smile. You stop wasting time on things that don't matter. You see what's real. She reached for his hand. This is real, John. This family, Edmund's love for you, our acceptance of you as our brother. Don't let old pain blind you to new joy. Edmund slipped away quietly, not wanting to intrude on the moment. But Catherine's words stayed with him. Don't let old pain blind you to new joy. It was advice he himself had needed to learn. That evening, the family gathered in the library for their customary reading. It had become tradition for someone to read aloud while the others listened. Tonight it was John's turn. He'd chosen a collection of folk tales, and he read with expression, doing different voices for the characters. The children were entranced. Even Mrs. Hawthorne and Thomas, who often joined them for these evenings, smiled at John's performance. When the reading ended, William climbed into John's lap. Will you read to us tomorrow, too? If you'd like, John said, and Edmund saw the walls around his son's heart continuing to crumble. Later, as they prepared for bed, Edmund walked John to his room. They paused in the hallway, both seeming reluctant to end the day. I've been thinking, John said, about what Catherine said, about letting go of old pain. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I can't pretend the past didn't happen. Those years in the institutions, the hunger, the fear, they shaped who I am, but maybe they don't have to define who I become. No, Edmund agreed. They don't. I'd like to stay longer. After these 2 weeks, I'd like to see if I could make Liverpool less permanent and Thornfield more like home. John looked at Edmund. If that's all right with you. Edmund felt emotion rise in his throat. It's more than all right. It's everything I hoped for but didn't dare ask. I'm not promising forever, John cautioned. I'm still figuring this out, but I want to try. For you, for them, for the mother I never knew but who seems to have believed in second chances. Eleanor would be so proud of you, Edmund said. I'm proud of you, John nodded, his eyes bright. Thank you. For not giving up on me, for finding me, for giving me a reason to believe family could be real. They embraced then, father and son, bridging 30 years of absence with a moment of connection that felt like coming. Home. August brought heat that shimmered over the hills and a heaviness to the air that made Catherine's breathing even more labored. Dr. Pemberton came daily now, his face growing grimmer with each visit. The household moved quietly, as if loud noises might disturb the fragile balance keeping Catherine with them. She spent most of her time in bed now, the silver cross at her throat catching the light from the window. The children took turns sitting with her, reading to her, telling her about their days. She listened with fierce attention, as if memorizing every detail. One evening, Catherine asked for everyone to gather in her room. Edmund helped her sit up, propping pillows behind her. John stood by the window, his face tight with barely controlled emotion. The younger children clustered on the bed around her, careful not to jostle her. I need to say something, Catherine began, her voice weak but steady. While I still can, I need you all to understand what you've given me. She looked at each face in turn. When we left Grimsby, I didn't think we'd survive. I thought we'd freeze in that storm, die on some roadside, and no one would ever know or care. But I had to try. I had to give them a chance. She reached for William's hand. You were so small, so scared. You hadn't spoken in months. And now look at you. Growing strong, laughing, learning. You have a future now. William pressed his face against her shoulder, tears streaming down his cheeks. Catherine touched Samuel's hair. Your curiosity will take you far. You'll be a great doctor someday. You'll save lives the way Edmund saved ours. Samuel nodded, unable to speak. Margaret, Catherine continued, you'll write beautiful things, important things. You'll use that brilliant mind to make the world better. Margaret took Catherine's hand, kissing it. Because you taught me I could. James, Catherine said, you'll take care of them when I'm gone. You'll be strong for them. But remember, being strong doesn't mean being alone. Let them help you too. James's jaw clenched. Don't talk like this. Don't say goodbye. I have to, Catherine said gently, because I need you to know how proud I am of you, of all of you. You survived things that would have broken most people. You stayed good despite everything trying to make you hard. She turned to John. I'm so glad you came back. They need an older brother, someone who understands what they've been through. And Edmund needs you. Promise me you'll stay, that you'll be family. I promise, John said, his voice breaking. Finally, Catherine looked at Edmund. Papa, you gave me everything I never thought I'd have. A home, a father, brothers and sisters. You let me die loved. That's a gift beyond measure. Edmund sat on the edge of the bed, taking both her hands in his. You gave me just as much. You reminded me how to live. How to love. You saved me, Catherine. We saved each other, she said. That's what families do. She was quiet for a moment, gathering strength. There's something else. I want to be buried here, in the garden, near Eleanor's roses. I want to stay with you, even after. Of course, Edmund said. You'll always be part of Thornfield. Always part of us. That night, Catherine slipped into sleep and didn't wake. Dr. Pemberton said her heart had simply stopped, worn out by months of fighting. She went peacefully, surrounded by family, in the home she'd fought so hard to reach. The grief that settled over the household was profound. William wouldn't leave her room for 2 days. Margaret couldn't stop crying. Samuel withdrew into silence. James broke things, his anger and pain seeking outlet. John, who'd known her such a short time but loved her fiercely, sat alone in the library staring at nothing. Edmund moved through it all in a daze, making arrangements, comforting the children, holding himself together because they needed him to. But at night, alone in his study, he wept for the daughter he'd had for such a brief time, the girl who'd knocked on his door and changed everything. They buried Catherine on a golden afternoon, in the garden she'd loved, with all the village attending. Reverend Matthews spoke of her courage and faith. Edmund read from Eleanor's favorite psalm. The children each placed a flower on her grave, William laying the wooden soldier beside them. She'll need it in heaven, he explained, to remember us. As the last mourners departed, the family stood together at the graveside. 6 people bound by choice rather than blood, by shared grief and shared love. They'd lost Catherine, but her gift remained. She'd brought them together. She'd shown them what family could be. And in doing so, she'd ensured that her brief life mattered more than many that lasted decades. Edmund placed his hand on the simple stone marker. Thank you, he whispered, for everything. The children gathered close, and John put his arm around Edmund's shoulders. They stood together as the sun set over Thornfield, a family forged in pain, but tempered by love, facing whatever came next together. Autumn arrived with its promise of change and renewal. The leaves turned gold and crimson, falling in gentle spirals to carpet the grounds. 6 months had passed since Catherine's death, and while the grief remained, it had softened into something the family could carry without being crushed by it. John had made his decision permanent. He'd sold his printing shop in Liverpool, using the proceeds to establish a small press on the Thornfield estate. He taught James the business side while pursuing his craft. The first book they printed together was a collection of Catherine's poems and writings, compiled by Margaret. They distributed copies throughout the region, her words reaching people who'd never known her, but who were moved by her wisdom. William had started proper schooling with Mr. Hendricks, showing particular talent for drawing. His sketches of the manor, the gardens, and his family covered the walls of his room. He still carried the wooden soldier everywhere, though now it lived in his pocket rather than his hand. He was growing, no longer the silent, traumatized child who'd arrived in the snow. Samuel's fascination with medicine had only deepened. Dr. Pemberton had taken him on as an unofficial apprentice, teaching him to prepare medicines and understand basic diagnoses. The boy had a gift for it, a gentleness with patients that reminded the doctor of the best physicians he'd known. He spoke often of attending university someday, of becoming the kind of doctor who actually helped people instead of turning them away. Margaret had blossomed into a confident young woman, She tutored children in the village now, teaching them to read and write. She'd convinced Edmund to fund a small library in Ashworth Below, open to everyone regardless of their station. It was named Catherine's Library, and above the door hung a quote from one of her poems. "Knowledge is the light that guides us home." James had grown into his role as heir to the estate. He worked alongside Thomas daily, learning every aspect of land management, but he'd also inherited Edmund's growing concern for social reform. He'd begun speaking at county meetings about workhouse conditions, advocating for change with a passion born of personal experience. He was no longer the defensive, angry boy who'd expected abandonment. He'd become a young man of purpose and principle. Edmund himself had changed more than he'd thought possible. The isolation that had defined him for 20 years was gone, replaced by engagement with the world. He served on committees, funded charitable works, and opened Thornfield to those in need. People no longer spoke of Lord Ashworth with fear or pity, but with respect and affection. He'd become the man Eleanor had believed he could be, the father his children deserved. On a crisp October morning, Edmund stood in the portrait gallery before Eleanor's painting. He came here still, but now the visits brought peace rather than pain. He thought of Catherine's words, about not letting old grief blind him to new joy. He'd learned that lesson. The past and present could coexist. He could honor what he'd lost while celebrating what he'd found. "Papa?" William's voice called from the hallway. "We're ready for the portrait sitting." Edmund smiled. The artist was returning to create an updated family portrait, one that included John and honored Catherine's memory. They'd decided to hang it beside Eleanor's painting, linking past and present. The family gathered in the library, their chosen spot. Edmund took his place in the center, John standing beside him. The 4 younger children arranged themselves naturally, comfortable with each other and with their positions in the family. On a small table beside them sat the wooden soldier, Eleanor's cross necklace, and Catherine's first journal. Objects that told their story. As the artist worked, Edmund looked at each face. John, finally at peace with his past. James, strong and purposeful. Margaret, brilliant and kind. Samuel, curious and compassionate. William, happy and whole. These were his children. Not all by blood, but all by choice, by love, by the commitment they'd made to each other on a snowy night that now felt like both yesterday and a lifetime ago. Mr. Whitmore, the artist, stepped back to assess his work. "It's remarkable," he said. "The love in this family. It radiates from every face. This will be one of my finest pieces." Edmund knew he was right. Not because of artistic technique, but because of what the portrait would capture. A family built on second chances, on healing, on the revolutionary idea that love was stronger than blood, that redemption was always possible, that it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. That evening, after dinner, the family gathered in Catherine's garden. It had become their tradition to spend time there together, to remember her, and to celebrate the life she'd given them. Edmund had planted a rose bush on her grave, and it had bloomed spectacularly through summer and into fall. They stood together in the fading light, and Edmund spoke the words that had become their ritual. "Catherine brought us together. She showed us what family could be. We honor her by loving each other, by staying together, by remembering that we're stronger united than we ever were alone. Always together." The children responded in unison, John's voice joining theirs. As they walked back to the manor, Edmund put his arms around his sons, his daughter by his side, and felt complete. The manor that had been a tomb was now a home. The man who'd been dead was now fully alive, and 5 children who'd had nothing now had everything that mattered. The door stood open, light spilling out into the darkness, welcoming them in. Welcoming anyone who needed shelter, who needed family, who needed to know that sometimes the most broken people can heal each other, that sometimes the greatest families are the ones we choose, that sometimes a snowy night and a desperate plea can change everything. Edmund looked back once at the garden where Catherine rested, at the roses blooming despite the autumn chill. "Thank you," he whispered again, "for knocking on my door, for saving me, for showing me that love is always worth the risk." And then he turned toward home, toward his children, toward the future they would build together. A future Catherine had made possible with her courage, her wisdom, and her simple request that had contained everything. Be our father before we die here. He had become their father. They had become his children. And in saving each other, they had discovered that sometimes the family we need finds us exactly when we've stopped looking, exactly when we need it most, exactly when we're finally ready to let love in again.